He possessed a bloodline that commanded empires, a fortune that could buy nations, and a destiny written in the stars as one of Europe's most powerful men. Yet, he voluntarily stripped himself of every title, was erased from the imperial history books, and ultimately vanished into the freezing void of the ocean, leaving behind no body, no grave, and no closure. His name was Archduke Johann Salvator. How did a man born to wear the weight of a crown end up choosing the terrifying freedom of a sinking ship in the middle of nowhere? That collapse was inevitable. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a colossus fracturing under its own weight, trapped between the gilded grandeur of the old world and the violent birth of the new, a magnificent, sprawling contradiction that was doomed to tear itself apart. At the center of this spiderweb sat Emperor Franz Joseph I, a man who viewed himself not merely as a monarch, but as the supreme bureaucrat of God. Franz Joseph was the embodiment of the old order. He rose before dawn every single day, standing at his desk in the Hofburg Palace, processing state papers with a relentless mechanical efficiency, believing that if he simply worked hard enough and adhered strictly enough to the Spanish court etiquette, he could hold back the tide of time itself. Vienna, the imperial capital, was a city of dazzling contradictions. On the surface, it was a glittering jewel of culture, the home of the waltz, the opera, and breathtaking architecture that screamed of permanence and power. Behind its shimmering facade, the empire was quietly buckling under the pressures of nationalism and time. It was a prison of nations, a cacophony of different languages, held together by the terrified grip of the military. Into this atmosphere of paranoid grandeur, Johann Salvator was thrust, not as a passive observer, but as a cog in a machine he would come to despise. However, Johann was not born in the chilly, repressed atmosphere of Vienna. He was born on November the 25th, 1852, in Florence, Italy, as a scion of the Tuscan branch of the House of Habsburg-Lorraine. This geographical distinction is crucial to understanding his psychological makeup. The Tuscan Habsburgs were different. They were separated from the main Viennese line by the Alps and by a cultural chasm. Living under the warmer Italian sun, surrounded by the artistic legacy of the Renaissance, the Tuscan court was historically more liberal, more intellectual, and less suffocated by the rigid protocol that paralyzed Vienna. Johann's father, Grand Duke Leopold II of Tuscany, was a ruler who had attempted to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian nationalism with a degree of moderation, but history had other plans. When Johann was just a young boy, the fires of the Risorgimento, the movement for Italian unification, swept through the peninsula. In 1859, the young Archduke witnessed a traumatic event that would shatter any illusion of royal invincibility. His family was deposed. He watched as his father was forced to abdicate, and the family was expelled from their beloved Florence, fleeing north to the safety and the cage of the Austrian court. This early trauma instilled in Johann a lesson that his cousin, Crown Prince Rudolph, and the Emperor Franz Joseph never fully grasped. That thrones are fragile, that public adoration can turn to hatred overnight, and that being a Habsburg was no guarantee of survival. He arrived in Austria as an exile, a prince without a throne, carrying the stigma of a failed branch of the family. As he grew into adolescence in Vienna, this sense of being an outsider never left him. He was undeniably a Habsburg. He possessed the famous Habsburg lip and the piercing blue eyes of his ancestors, but his spirit was foreign. While the archdukes of the main line were educated to be unquestioning pillars of the state, trained primarily in hunting, religion, and ceremonial duties, Johann's mind was voracious and dangerously sharp. He consumed books on philosophy, liberal politics, and military strategy with a hunger that unnerved his tutors. He looked at the world not as it was, but as it could be, a perspective that was inherently treasonous in the eyes of the conservative court. As was customary for all male members of the dynasty, Johann was destined for a military career. But unlike many of his relatives who treated their commissions as decorative titles, Johann Salvator took the profession of arms with deadly seriousness. He entered the army not as a prince playing soldier, but as a student of warfare. He saw the Austrian military not as a glorious institution, but as a broken relic. The mid-19th century was a time of rapid technological and tactical evolution. The Prussians were revolutionizing warfare with needle guns, railways, and a highly professionalized general staff. In contrast, the Austrian army was mired in nepotism, obsessed with the visual splendor of parades rather than the gritty reality of logistics, and led by aristocrats who owed their ranks to their bloodlines rather than their competence. Johann, with his keen intellect, saw the disaster approaching. The army clung to rituals, while the rest of Europe had already embraced industrial war, a suicide pact in the face of modernity. The catastrophe that Johann predicted arrived with brutal swiftness in 1866 during the Austro-Prussian War. The defeat at the Battle of Königgrätz was not just a loss, it was a humiliation that shook the empire to its foundations. The Prussian war machine pulverized the Austrians, exposing the rot within Franz Joseph's military. For the young Johann Salvator, this was a formative, radicalizing moment. He saw thousands of brave men die senselessly because of incompetent leadership and outdated weaponry. The defeat confirmed his worst fears. The men in charge, the men he was supposed to obey, were sleepwalking toward the abyss. It was during this period that Johann began to transform from a silent observer into a vocal critic, a transformation that would earn him powerful enemies. He began to write. At first, his critiques were private, shared only in the hushed conversations of the officers' mess, but soon his passion for reform could not be contained. He authored pamphlets and technical manuals on artillery and infantry tactics, often arguing for a more democratic approach to leadership that valued the life of the common soldier. He critiqued the stiff, mindless drill exercises that the emperor loved, arguing instead for flexibility and initiative. In the rigid hierarchy of the Austrian army, this was heresy. For an archduke, a member of the imperial house, to publicly criticize the army was seen as a direct attack on the emperor himself, who was the supreme commander. Johann was branded a Red Archduke, a derisive nickname meant to imply that his sympathies lay with liberals, republicans, and revolutionaries. Yet despite the friction, his talent was undeniable. He rose rapidly through the ranks, becoming a major general and later a field marshal lieutenant. His soldiers adored him because he actually cared about their welfare, checking their rations and their boots. But his fellow generals viewed him with deep suspicion. To them, he was a dangerous intellectual, a man who thought he knew better than the emperor. Parallel to his military life, Johann nurtured a private world that was equally scandalous to the court. He was an artist. In a family that viewed the arts as something to be patronized but never practiced by royalty, Johann was a gifted composer. He wrote waltzes, not the stiff ceremonial marches expected of a prince, but fluid emotional music that rivaled the popular tunes of the Strauss family. The Valse de la Reine and other compositions flowed from his pen, but he was forced to publish them under pseudonyms, hiding his creative soul behind false names, just as he hid his liberal politics behind his uniform. This duality, the artist trapped in a general's uniform, the liberal trapped in an autocracy, created a profound psychological fracture in Johann. He was living two lives, and the strain was becoming unbearable. He found the atmosphere of the Hofburg Palace, with its endless rounds of meaningless receptions and gossip, to be physically repulsive. He began to avoid the court, retreating to his own circle of friends, a move that only deepened his isolation and the rumors swirling around him. It was in this state of alienation that Johann formed the most significant alliance of his life, a bond that would define his destiny and ultimately seal his fate. He found a kindred spirit in the one person who was even more trapped than he was, the heir to the throne, Crown Prince Rudolph. Rudolph was the tragic mirror image of Johann. 8 years younger than Johann, Rudolph was sensitive, highly intelligent, and violently opposed to his father's conservative policies. The two cousins were drawn together by their shared misery and their shared vision for a different Austria. They met in secret, often late at night, to drink wine and discuss the forbidden topics: federalism, democracy, the rights of the empire's ethnic minorities, and the desperate need to modernize the monarchy before it collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. To the conservative establishment, the friendship between Johann Salvator and Crown Prince Rudolph was terrifying. Here were the two most capable, intelligent men of the younger generation, and both of them were essentially rebels. The secret police, who were omnipresent in Vienna, began to monitor their correspondence. Reports were filed on their meetings. The emperor was informed that Johann was a bad influence on the impressionable crown prince, encouraging his radical tendencies. But for Johann and Rudolph, their bond was a lifeline. They constituted a shadow court, a government in waiting that promised a new dawn for the empire once the old emperor passed away. They dreamed of an Austria that was a beacon of progress, not a dungeon of tradition. But they had underestimated the sheer longevity of Franz Joseph and the entrenched power of the system he represented. The emperor was not going anywhere, and he would not tolerate dissent even from his own blood. As the 1880s progressed, the tension between Johann and the emperor escalated from simmering resentment to open conflict. Johann was given command of a division in Linz, a posting that was technically a promotion but felt like an exile from the center of power. Yet even in Linz, Johann could not be silenced. He continued to push for reforms, continued to write, and continued to live a life that flouted convention. It was during this period that the final, insurmountable wedge was driven between him and the dynasty. He fell in love. But he did not fall in love with a princess of Bavaria or a duchess of Saxony, as was his duty. He fell in love with Ludmilla Stubel, a middle-class ballet dancer at the Vienna court opera. In the eyes of the Habsburg house laws, which governed the marriages and conduct of the archdukes with medieval severity, Ludmilla Stubel was a non-entity. She was a commoner, a woman who earned a wage, a creature of the stage. For an archduke to have an affair with a dancer was commonplace, even expected. The sexual hypocrisy of the era allowed royal men to have as many mistresses as they pleased, provided they eventually married a woman of equal rank to breed legitimate heirs. But Johann Salvator did not want a mistress. He wanted a wife. He wanted a partner who stimulated his mind and offered him the emotional warmth that his icy family could not. He made no secret of his devotion to Millie, appearing with her in public, treating her with the respect due a consort. This was a direct slap in the face to the court. It was a rejection of the fundamental principle of the monarchy, that royal blood was sacred and must remain pure. The whispers in Vienna turned to shouts. Johann was reckless, they said. He was insane. He was throwing away his future for a ballet girl. But Johann, emboldened by his love and his growing disgust with the hypocrisy of the elite, dug in his heels. He saw in Millie the embodiment of the freedom he craved, a life based on talent and emotion, not on dusty genealogy. He began to realize that he could not have both. He could not be a Habsburg archduke and a free man. The two states of being were mutually exclusive. As the year 1888 drew to a close, the pressure on Johann was immense. The emperor was cold and distant. His military career was stalled by politics, and his personal life was under constant scrutiny. But he still had hope. He still had Rudolph. As long as the crown prince was the heir, there was a chance that the future could be salvaged. Johann believed that if he could just hold on until Rudolph ascended the throne, everything would change. They would sweep away the cobwebs, modernize the army, and legitimize his relationship with Millie. Rudolph was the key to everything. And then came the winter of 1889. The winter of 1889 descended upon Vienna with a brutality that felt almost malicious. The Danube froze into a jagged scar of gray ice, and the fog that rolled off the river seemed to penetrate the very stone of the Hofburg Palace, chilling the occupants to the bone. But the meteorological cold was nothing compared to the political frost that was about to settle over the empire. For Johann Salvator, the days leading up to January 30th were marked by a growing sense of unease. His cousin, Crown Prince Rudolph, had been erratic, more manic than usual, oscillating between feverish plans for the future and dark, nihilistic depressions. They had spoken often of the burden of their birth, but Johann, ever the pragmatist, had always believed they would survive it. He believed they were playing a long game, a game of endurance against the aging emperor. He did not realize that Rudolph had already decided to fold his hand. On the morning of January 30th, 1889, the news broke not as a shout, but as a bewildered whisper that raced through the corridors of power before spilling out into the frozen streets. The crown prince was dead. The initial official reports were a clumsy, panic-stricken tapestry of lies. The court, terrified of the truth, announced that the 30-year-old heir to the throne had died of apoplexy, a heart attack. For Johann, the news was a physical blow. He rushed to the Hofburg, his mind racing. A heart attack? Rudolph was young, vital, and physically fit. The explanation was an insult to the intelligence of anyone who knew him. But as Johann navigated the hushed, terrified atmosphere of the court, the darker truth began to bleed through the cracks of the official narrative. There was another body. At the hunting lodge in Mayerling, deep in the Vienna woods, they had found not just the prince, but the lifeless form of 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vetsera. And there were guns. When the truth finally emerged that the heir to the apostolic majesty had shot his teenage mistress and then turned the revolver on himself, it shattered the psychological foundation of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. For the faithful subjects, it was an incomprehensible blasphemy. But for Johann Salvator, it was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions that confirmed his darkest theories about his family. Standing near the coffin during the elaborate, suffocating funeral rites, Johann looked at the face of Emperor Franz Joseph. He saw a father who was grieving, yes, but he also saw a monarch who was already working to erase the sin of his son to protect the institution. The church had to be bullied into granting a Christian burial for a suicide. The existence of Mary Vetsera was ruthlessly scrubbed from the records, her body smuggled out of Mayerling in a carriage propped up between her uncles to look like she was alive, in a macabre pantomime designed to avoid scandal. This callous, bureaucratic erasure of human tragedy broke something inside Johann Salvator. The grief for his cousin, his best friend, his political hope, his only intellectual equal, was compounded by a volcanic rage. He saw Rudolph not as a villain, but as a victim. He viewed Mayerling not as a crime of passion, but as the inevitable result of a system that crushed the human spirit. Rudolph had been suffocated by the rigid expectations of the court, by a loveless marriage forced upon him for dynastic reasons, and by a father who refused to let him breathe. Johann realized with terrifying clarity, they killed him. The protocol, the silence, the rigidity, it killed him as surely as the bullet. In the weeks following the funeral, Johann became dangerous. The shadow court was dead. The liberal dream was buried in the imperial crypt alongside Rudolph. Most of the hangers-on, the journalists and fair-weather friends who had surrounded the crown prince, scattered like rats, terrified of the emperor's wrath. But Johann stood his ground. He refused to mourn in the prescribed silent manner. He spoke out. He questioned the handling of the investigation. He openly criticized the hypocrisy of a court that would drive a man to suicide and then worry more about the reputation of the dynasty than the loss of a son. There are persistent historical rumors, never proven, but deeply ingrained in the lore of the time, that Johann was in possession of a box of Rudolph's papers. Some claimed these were letters explaining the suicide. Others whispered they were political manifestos outlining a plan to overthrow Franz Joseph. Whether or not these papers existed, the fear of them made Johann a target. The secret police intensified their surveillance. Every letter he wrote was open. Every visitor to his home was logged. The atmosphere around him grew toxic. Old friends in the military stopped returning his salutes. Invitations to court functions accidentally failed to arrive. He was being ghosted by the empire he had sworn to defend. The confrontation with Emperor Franz Joseph was inevitable. We do not have a transcript of their final private meeting, but we can reconstruct the emotional violence of the encounter from the outcome. It was the collision of two immovable objects, the emperor, who embodied the duty to the past, and the Archduke, who demanded a right to the future. For Franz Joseph, Johann's continued insubordination, his morganatic romance with the dancer Millie Stubel, and his refusal to toe the line after the scandal of Mayerling were intolerable acts of treason. The emperor likely offered him a choice: conform, give up Millie, and accept a remote posting where he could do no harm, or leave. Johann Salvator looked at the emperor, this man of granite who had survived wars, revolutions, and the suicide of his own son without bending, and realized there was no winning. To stay was to die a slow spiritual death. To stay was to become a husk, a uniform without a man inside it, just another ornamental Habsburg waiting for the end. He thought of Rudolph, cold in his crypt. He thought of Millie, warm and alive, waiting for him. And so he chose life, but the price of life was his identity. In the autumn of 1889, Archduke Johann Salvator initiated the legal proceedings. To do the unthinkable, he formally renounced his membership in the imperial house. This was not a simple resignation. It was a metaphysical unmaking. The Habsburgs believed their rank was ordained by God. To reject it was almost a sacrilege. The legal process was humiliating and thorough. He had to sign away his rights to the succession. He had to forfeit his massive state income. He had to return his military commissions, his sashes, his medals, including the Order of the Golden Fleece, the highest honor in Catholic Europe. One can imagine the scene in the Hofburg as he signed the final documents. The scratching of the pen in the silent room was the sound of a man cutting his own throat to save his soul. When he put the pen down, he was no longer His Imperial and Royal Highness, Archduke Johann Salvator of Austria-Tuscany. He was a civilian. He was a nobody. He chose the name Johann Orth. It was derived from Schloss Orth, a castle he owned on the Tronsey Lake, a place where he had spent some of his few happy moments. But the name also sounded common, solid, unpretentious. It was a name that could belong to a merchant, a teacher, or a sailor. It was a blank slate. The emperor accepted the renunciation with cold efficiency. The official gazette published the notice, and just like that, the Archduke was erased. The court breathed a collective sigh of relief. The troublemaker was gone. They assumed he would retire to a villa in Switzerland or Paris, living out his days as a scandalous but harmless exile, perhaps drinking himself to death or writing bitter memoirs. But Johann Orth had a different plan. He did not want to be an idle expatriate, living off the scraps of his former glory. He wanted to work. He wanted to confront the elements. He wanted to strip away the softness of palace life and test himself against the only force on earth that didn't care about titles, the ocean. He traveled to London, a city that offered anonymity and maritime commerce. There, in a quiet registry office, stripped of all pomp, without bishops or choirs or cannon salutes, he finally married Ludmilla Millie Stubel. It was the culmination of years of struggle. Millie, the dancer who had been sneered at by duchesses, was now the lawful wife of the man who could have been a king. Their union was a defiant victory of love over protocol. But marriage was only the first step. Johann began to study for his master mariner's license. This was no hobby. He threw himself into the technical complexities of navigation, astronomy, and maritime law with the same intellectual ferocity he had once applied to military strategy. He wanted to earn his way. He purchased a ship, a sturdy iron-hulled merchant vessel named the Santa Margherita. He renamed it the Saint Margaret. This was not a luxury yacht. It was a working cargo ship. Johann intended to trade. He hired a crew, a mix of Dalmatians and Norwegians, men who were rough, experienced, and unimpressed by his former life. To them he was simply Captain Orth. There is something profoundly moving about this transformation. Picture the man who had commanded tens of thousands of soldiers on the parade grounds of Vienna, now standing on the heaving deck of a merchant ship, learning to splice rope, checking the cargo manifest, shouting orders over the roar of the wind. He was shedding the skin of the Archduke layer by layer. However, the transition was not seamless. The Austrian authorities watched him with paranoid suspicion even in London. They couldn't believe he was simply becoming a merchant captain. The rumors persisted that he was planning a coup, that he was gathering an army, that he was sailing to South America to establish a new liberal empire. Johann ignored them. He was focused on the horizon. In the spring of 1890, the preparations were complete. The St. Margaret was loaded with a cargo of cement and general goods. The destination was South America, Valparaiso, Chile. It was a journey to the other side of the world, a journey that required navigating the treacherous waters of Cape Horn, the sailor's graveyard. On the day of departure, as the gray coastline of Europe began to recede into the mist, Johann stood at the helm. Beside him was Millie. They were leaving everything behind: the palaces, the graves, the spies, the emperor. They were sailing into absolute freedom. But freedom, as Johann was about to discover, is a terrifyingly vast ocean, and the further one sails from the shore of the known world, the deeper the waters become. He had escaped the cage of the Habsburgs, but he was sailing directly into the jaws of a much older, much more indifferent power. The land was gone, the sea lay ahead, and the storm was waiting. The Atlantic Ocean is a vast, indifferent wilderness, a place where the intricate hierarchies of human society dissolve into the elemental binary of survival or death. For Johann Orth, standing on the bridge of the St. Margaret, In the spring of 1890, this emptiness was not terrifying. It was a religious experience. For the first time in his 38 years, he was not defined by who his ancestors were, but by what he could do. The ocean did not care that his cousin was the Emperor of Austria. It did not care about the Golden Fleece or the scandal of Mayerling. It only cared if he could read a sextant, calculate his longitude, and keep his iron-hulled ship from broaching in a swell. As the coast of Europe faded into a smudge of gray on the horizon, a profound psychological weight lifted from his shoulders. The gilded cage of Vienna, with its spies and its suffocating etiquette, was thousands of miles astern. Ahead lay only the curvature of the earth and the promise of a new life in Chile. The St. Margaret was no pleasure yacht. It was a serious working merchant vessel, roughly 1,400 tons, painted a utilitarian black. Johann had purchased it not as a toy, but as a livelihood. He was determined to prove to the world, and perhaps to himself, that he was more than a decorative prince. He was carrying a cargo of cement and general merchandise, intending to trade for saltpeter and copper in South America. The crew he had assembled was a motley collection of hardened sailors, mostly Dalmatians and Scandinavians, men who knew the sea but knew little of court politics. To them, he was simply Captain Orth, a man who was surprisingly knowledgeable about navigation but possessed an intensity that hinted at a complicated past. He worked alongside them, his hands, once accustomed to white kid gloves, now stained with tar and salt. He took his watches, he inspected the rigging, and he shared the rough rations of the mess. It was a performance of normalcy, but it was also a desperate attempt to wash away the stain of royalty through the dignity of labor. Beside him through every nautical mile was Millie. If Vienna had dismissed Ludmilla Stubel as a frivolous dancer, the Atlantic revealed her true steel. She was not merely a passenger. She was the captain's wife in the truest sense. She adapted to the harsh, cramping conditions of life at sea with a resilience that surprised even Johann. There were no servants to dress her, no orchestras to entertain her, only the endless rhythm of the waves and the creaking of the ship's timbers. In the intimacy of their cabin, surrounded by maps and logbooks, they were finally, truly married. The scandal that had shaken an empire was reduced to the quiet, private love of a man and a woman sharing a cup of tea while a gale howled outside the porthole. They were arguably the happiest they had ever been. The voyage south was long and arduous. They crossed the equator, the heat turning the iron hull into an oven before descending into the cooling waters of the southern hemisphere. Their destination was La Plata in Argentina, the final refueling stop before the ultimate test, the passage around Cape Horn. When the St. Margaret docked in La Plata in the early summer of 1890, it caused a minor sensation. The telegraph wires hummed with the news that the missing Archduke had surfaced. Journalists and local dignitaries flocked to the port, hoping for a glimpse of the fallen royalty. Johann, however, was evasive. He had little patience for the celebrity he was trying to outrun. He was focused on the ship. It was in La Plata that the first ominous notes of the tragedy began to sound. The St. Margaret had sustained damage during the Atlantic crossing. She needed repairs. Johann, meticulous to a fault, oversaw the refitting, but he was also impatient. He wrote what would become his final letters to friends back in Europe. These documents are haunting in their prescience. In a letter to a close confidant, he wrote with a mix of fatalism and defiance, "I am going to sea again. If I do not return, do not look for me. The ocean is a good grave. It keeps its secrets." He seemed to understand on some level that he was pushing his luck. He knew the reputation of the route ahead. The plan was to sail from La Plata, south along the Argentine coast, and then turn west to round Cape Horn, the southernmost tip of the continent, before heading north to Valparaiso, Chile. Any sailor worth his salt knew what this meant. Cape Horn is not merely a geographical landmark, it is a maritime graveyard. It is the only place on Earth where the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans collide without any land to break the momentum of the waves. The roaring 40s and the furious 50s, the prevailing westerly winds, circle the bottom of the globe uninterrupted, building up kinetic energy over thousands of miles until they slam into the Horn. Crucially, fatally, it was July. In the southern hemisphere, July is the dead of winter. Local captains in La Plata likely warned Johann. They would have told him that attempting the Horn in July was madness. The days would be short, offering only a few hours of gray, murky light. The temperatures would be freezing, coating the rigging in ice that could make the ship top-heavy and prone to capsizing. The waves could reach the height of an 8-story building, rogue monsters that could snap a ship's keel like a matchstick. But Johann Orth was a man who had spent his entire life being told what he could not do, and he had spent his entire life defying those limitations. He had defied the emperor, he had defied the church, and now he believed he could defy nature. Perhaps he felt that after surviving the shark tank of Vienna, the ocean was a manageable adversary. Or perhaps, deep down, he simply didn't care. The line between bravery and a death wish is often invisible to the man walking it. On July 12, 1890, the St. Margaret was sighted for the last time. It was spotted near Cape Tres Puntas on the coast of Patagonia. The weather was deteriorating. The sky was a bruised purple, the barometer was plummeting, and the wind was beginning to scream. Another ship passed them, exchanging signals. Johann Orth was on the bridge. The St. Margaret turned her bow south into the gathering gloom. What happened next has never been recorded by human eyes, but it can be reconstructed with terrifying accuracy by anyone familiar with the Southern Ocean. As the St. Margaret pushed further south, leaving the shelter of the continent, she would have entered the Drake Passage. Here, the ocean transforms. The waves are not rhythmic swells. They are chaotic, confused mountains of water that attack from multiple directions. In the winter of 1890, the storms were reported to be particularly vicious. The ship, heavy with cement, would have been sluggish in the water. As the gale force winds hit, reaching speeds of 80 or 90 miles per hour, the sea would have become a white, blinding foam. Imagine the scene on the bridge. It is pitch black, the sun having set at 3 p.m. The noise is deafening, a physical assault on the ears that makes communication impossible. The ship is pitching violently, the bow burying itself into green water and struggling to rise. The cold is absolute. The spray freezes the moment it hits the deck, turning the ropes into steel bars and the sails into sheets of ice. Johann Orth, the man who once danced waltzes in the gilded ballrooms of the Hofburg, is now clinging to a stanchion, staring into the abyss. He is shouting orders that the wind tears away before they can be heard. Millie is likely below decks, thrown from side to side in the cabin. The sound of the ocean hammering against the hull like a sledgehammer. Did they realize it was the end? There is a specific horror to a maritime disaster in the Southern Ocean. It is not like a battle where there is an enemy to fight. It is a slow, grinding realization of insignificance. A rudder chain snaps, a hatch cover is smashed by a rogue wave, allowing tons of water to pour into the hold. The cargo shifts, listing the ship fatally to one side. Or perhaps in the darkness, they simply ran straight into an iceberg, invisible in the snow squalls until the moment of impact. Whatever the specific mechanism of destruction, the end would have been swift. In those waters, survival is not earned, it is permitted, and that night permission was denied. The St. Margaret would have slid beneath the surface. There would have been no lifeboats launched. In those seas, a lifeboat is a coffin. There would have been no distress signal heard, there was no radio, and no other ships were foolish enough to be in that sector. The ocean simply opened up and swallowed the Archduke, the dancer, and the crew. The freezing water claimed them instantly, and then the waves closed over the spot, rolling on as they had for millions of years, leaving absolutely no trace that a ship had ever been there. Back in Vienna, time moved differently. In the weeks following July 1890, there was no immediate alarm. Mail took months to arrive. Ships were often delayed by weather. The emperor continued his paperwork. The court continued its gossip. But as August turned to September and September to October, a silence began to grow. The St. Margaret was overdue in Valparaiso. The maritime insurance agents at Lloyd's of London posted the ship as missing. The telegraph lines began to chatter again. Where is Johann Orth? The delay in confirmation created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the most powerful force in human psychology: denial. It was impossible, people argued, that a man of such prominence could simply vanish. He was a Habsburg. He was a general. He was a celebrity. Figures like that don't just drown in the dark. They have endings. They have funerals. They have closure. The idea that he was just gone, dissolved into the elements like a handful of salt, was too terrifying to accept. By late 1890, the Austrian government, the very entity that had treated him as a pariah, was forced to act. Emperor Franz Joseph, faced with the potential loss of yet another family member so soon after Rudolph, ordered an investigation. But how do you investigate a disappearance in the most remote stretch of water on the planet? Cruisers were dispatched to scour the coastline of Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego. They searched the desolate, windswept islands where shipwreck survivors sometimes washed ashore, living on seal meat and shellfish. They found driftwood. They found the wreckage of other unfortunate ships. But of the St. Margaret, they found nothing. Not a lifebelt, not a spar, not a bottle with a note. The void was absolute, and because there was no body, the story refused to die. If there is no corpse, there is no death, only absence. And absence is a canvas upon which the world paints its fantasies. In the coffee houses of Vienna, the whispers began. They said he hadn't died. They said he had faked the shipwreck to escape the spies of the emperor. They said he had bought a ranch in Argentina and was living there with Millie, laughing at the obituary notices. Some claimed to have seen him in Uruguay, smoking a pipe and looking older. Others whispered darker, more conspiratorial theories, that he had been intercepted by an Austrian gunboat and sunk on the emperor's secret orders to prevent him from publishing a memoir that would destroy the monarchy. The mystery of Johann Orth transformed from a news item into a legend. He became the hidden prince, the king under the mountain, the man who got away. But while the public spun romantic tales of survival, the legal machinery of the empire faced a complex bureaucratic nightmare. He had left behind a massive fortune, complicated wills, and a dynastic mess. The family couldn't declare him dead without proof, but they couldn't keep his estate in limbo forever. For 20 years, the file remained open, 20 years of waiting for a man who was almost certainly resting at the bottom of the Drake Passage, his bones mingling with the silt of the ocean floor, forever bound to the woman he loved. It wasn't until 1911 that the Austrian courts finally, reluctantly, issued a decree of death. But by then the legend had taken on a life of its own, and the ghost of Johann Orth had become a permanent fixture in the twilight of the Habsburg Empire. If the sinking of the St. Margaret was a physical tragedy. The aftermath was a psychological phenomenon that gripped the collective consciousness of Europe for decades. In the vacuum created by the lack of a body, a corpse, or even a piece of identifiable wreckage, the figure of Johann Orth ceased to be a man and transformed into a specter that haunted the dying Austro-Hungarian Empire. The human mind abhors a narrative without an ending. It struggles to process the idea that a life of such high drama, a royal birth, a forbidden romance, a spectacular renunciation, could simply terminate in the mute silence of the ocean. Consequently, the world refused to let him die. For the next 20 years, Johann Orth became the Elvis Presley of the 19th century, a man cited everywhere, from the cafes of Buenos Aires to the remote sheep stations of Patagonia, and even in the shadows of European capitals, always just out of reach, always just around the corner, allegedly waiting for the right moment to return and save his crumbling homeland. Back in Vienna, the reaction of the imperial court was a complex tapestry of relief, anxiety, and bureaucratic paralysis. Emperor Franz Joseph, a man whose life was defined by the systematic loss of everyone he loved, his brother executed in Mexico, his son dead by suicide, his wife assassinated, received the news of his nephew's disappearance with his characteristic stoicism. To the emperor, Johann had been a thorn in the side of the dynasty, a dangerously liberal Red Archduke whose ideas threatened the stability of the realm. In a cold Machiavellian sense, the silence from the South Atlantic was a solution to a political problem. There would be no more scandalous pamphlets, no more public criticisms of the army, no more embarrassments involving the ballet dancer. But Franz Joseph was also a stickler for legality and order, and the indeterminate status of Johann Orth created a legal nightmare that would drag on for a generation. The immediate issue was money. Johann Salvator had been an incredibly wealthy man. Before his departure, he had liquidated much of his property and deposited vast sums in Swiss and British banks, alongside the cash and jewels he reportedly carried on the St. Margaret. With no death certificate, this fortune sat in limbo. The Habsburg family, specifically Johann's brothers, were eager to claim the inheritance, but the Austrian courts were bound by the strict laws regarding missing persons. Without proof of death, the estate could not be probated. This legal gridlock fueled the fires of conspiracy. Why, the public asked, were the courts so hesitant? Was there secret evidence that he was still alive? Was the emperor receiving private reports from his spies in South America? It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty that the industry of denial began to flourish. Newspapers in Vienna, Paris, and London quickly realized that Johann Orth is dead was a headline that sold for one day, but Johann Orth sighted in Brazil was a headline that could sell for years. A narrative emerged that painted Johann not as a victim of the elements, but as a master of escape. The theories were imaginative, romantic, and entirely unsubstantiated, yet they were devoured by a public desperate for a hero. The most persistent theory was the pastoral idyll. This version of the story posited that the shipwreck of the St. Margaret had been a staged event, a brilliant piece of theater designed to throw the world off the scent. According to this myth, Johann and Millie had safely landed in South America, changed their identities yet again, and were living a life of rustic bliss on a remote hacienda in Argentina or Chile. In this fantasy, the former Archduke had traded his uniform for a poncho, spending his days herding cattle, and his evenings playing his waltzes on a battered piano, finally free from the toxic politics of Europe. This story appealed deeply to the romantic sensibilities of the age. It suggested that love could indeed conquer all, even death. It allowed the Austrian people to believe that somewhere one of their princes was happy. A darker, more sinister theory also took root, one that tied the disappearance back to the open wound of Mayerling. This was the Iron Mask theory. It suggested that Johann Orth had not drowned, nor had he escaped, but that he had been captured. Proponents of this theory whispered that the emperor's secret police, the Evidenzbureau, had tracked the St. Margaret across the Atlantic. They claimed that Johann possessed the legendary steel box of Crown Prince Rudolph, a cache of documents that proved Rudolph had been murdered or that contained proof of a political conspiracy so explosive it would destroy the monarchy. In this version of events, an Austrian gunboat had intercepted the merchant ship, sunk it to kill the crew and Millie, and spirited Johann away to a secret prison in an isolated castle where he lived out his days as a state prisoner, the man who knew too much. While historically baseless, this theory reflected the deep paranoia of the Austrian subjects toward their own surveillance state. As the years rolled by, the legend of Johann Orth began to attract a parade of impostors and charlatans. This is a common phenomenon in royal disappearances. Witness the false Dimitris of Russia or the women claiming to be Anastasia Romanov, but the case of Johann Orth was particularly fertile ground for frauds because few people outside the court knew what he looked like in his later years. Men with vague resemblances to the Archduke began to appear in various corners of the globe. In 1900, a man died in Uruguay claiming to be the lost prince. Another surfaced in San Francisco. Each claimant sparked a brief flurry of excitement, legal inquiries, and eventual disappointment. These impostors were often sad, delusional figures, projecting their own desire for significance onto the blank canvas of the missing Archduke. But their existence kept the wound open. The imperial family was forced to investigate several of these claims, dispatching agents to identify bodies or interview survivors, only to return with the same verdict: negative. Crucially, the survival of the legend was tied to the declining health of the empire itself. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Austria-Hungary was visibly disintegrating. The parliament was paralyzed by ethnic shouting matches. The military was falling further behind the other great powers, and the aging emperor Franz Joseph seemed like a fossil from another epoch. In this climate of decay, the memory of Johann Salvator was transformed into a symbol of what could have been. He was remembered as the progressive, the reformer, the man who had the vision to save the empire but was driven away by the stubbornness of the old guard. His ghost became a political critique. When the government blundered, people would whisper, "If only Johann were here." He remained eternally young, eternally brilliant, and eternally untainted by the failures of the state, precisely because he wasn't there to make any mistakes. The legal saga finally reached its climax in 1911, 21 years after the disappearance. The time frame is significant. Under Austrian law, a missing person could be declared legally dead after 20 years if they would have reached the age of 70, or if the circumstances of the disappearance made survival impossible. Johann would not have been 70, but the courts finally bowed to the overwhelming probability of the shipwreck. The proceedings were a final bureaucratic funeral. Witnesses were called to testify to the seaworthiness of the St. Margaret and the severity of the storms in July 1890. The court formally concluded that there was no evidence of survival. The death date was arbitrarily set as July 21st, 1890. With the stroke of a judge's pen, Archduke Johann Salvator was legally extinguished. His vast estate was divided among his relatives, sparking fresh rounds of family infighting and lawsuits that would last until the empire itself collapsed. But the legal declaration did little to silence the believers. If anything, the timing was suspicious to the conspiracy theorists. Why now? Why, after exactly 20 years, was the emperor clearing the decks for the inevitable war that everyone felt was coming? Indeed, the shadow of the coming Great War looms large over the end of this story. When Johann was declared dead in 1911, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne. Franz Ferdinand was a very different man from Johann or Rudolph. He was reactionary, unpopular, and choleric. The contrast was painful. The empire had lost the two golden princes, Rudolph and Johann, and was left with the difficult prince. 3 years later, in 1914, the bullets fired in Sarajevo would kill Franz Ferdinand and trigger the apocalypse that Johann Salvator had predicted decades earlier. There is a profound irony in the fact that Johann vanished just before the world he knew was obliterated. By disappearing in 1890, he missed the slow, agonizing death of his dynasty. He missed the horrors of World War I, the trenches, the starvation in Vienna, and the final abdication of the last emperor, Karl, in 1918. He remained preserved in the amber of the Victorian age, a romantic figure of the high seas, while his family was ground into dust by the tank treads of modern history. In the final analysis of the aftermath, one must consider the fate of Ludmilla Stubel. In the grand sweep of dynastic history, she is often relegated to a footnote, the dancer who ruined a prince. But in the narrative of the disappearance, she shares his fate completely. If the theories of survival were true, she lived out her life in love and obscurity. If the theories of murder were true, she was an innocent victim of state violence. But in the reality of the shipwreck, she died as she had lived the last years of her life, by his side, facing the darkness together. The court declared her dead alongside him, her name forever linked to his in the dry ledgers of the Austrian judiciary. It was the only official recognition she ever received from the empire, a shared date of death. As the years turned into decades, the name Johann Orth began to fade from the headlines, moving from current events into history and finally into folklore. The generation that knew him died out. The empire he fled disappeared from the maps, but the mystery remained, a stubborn question mark at the end of the Habsburg story. Did he cheat death? Did he find peace? Or did he simply find the cold reality of the ocean, the only force powerful enough to strip a Habsburg of his name? The silence of the South Atlantic offered no answers, only the endless rolling of the waves. To fully grasp the magnitude of Archduke Johann Salvator's erasure, one must visit the imperial crypt, the Kaisergruft, beneath the Capuchin church in Vienna. This claustrophobic subterranean necropolis is the final resting place of the Habsburg dynasty. Here, in elaborate sarcophagi of bronze and copper, adorned with skulls, crowns, and grieving angels, lie the bones of emperors and empresses who ruled Europe for 6 centuries. Emperor Franz Joseph is there, entombed in a massive casket that dominates the room. To his right lies his son, Crown Prince Rudolph, the tragedy of Mayerling forever sealed in metal. To his left lies Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, murdered by an anarchist's file. It is a room heavy with history, suffocating in its grandeur and its accumulated grief. But if you walk through these rows of royal dead looking for the name of Johann Salvator, you will find only empty space. He is the missing piece of the mosaic, the ghost who refused to be categorized, the only member of this tragic generation who denied the empire even his bones. His absence from the crypt is not merely a quirk of maritime misfortune, it is a profound historical symbol. By vanishing into the South Atlantic, Johann Salvator escaped the curse of the Habsburgs in the only way possible, by ceasing to be a Habsburg. While his relatives were assassinated, drove themselves to suicide, or died amidst the collapse of their world, Johann simply dissolved. In doing so, he achieved a strange kind of immortality. He remains forever suspended in the year 1890, eternally 38 years old, eternally sailing toward a new horizon, untainted by the blood and mud that would soon swallow his family. The historical tragedy of his disappearance lies not in what happened to him, but in what happened to Austria without him. Historians have long debated the what-ifs of the late Habsburg Empire, and Johann Salvator features prominently in these counterfactual nightmares. He and Rudolph represented the liberal alternative, a path not taken. They envisioned a United States of Greater Austria, a federalized empire, where the Slavic populations were equal partners, where the military was a meritocracy, and where the monarchy evolved into a constitutional protector rather than an absolute ruler. When Rudolph shot himself and Johann sailed away, the liberal wing of the dynasty was effectively decapitated. The intellectual void they left was catastrophic. Into this vacuum stepped Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the new heir to the throne. The contrast between Johann and Franz Ferdinand could not have been more stark. Where Johann was charismatic, artistic, and beloved by the common soldiers, Franz Ferdinand was choleric, reactionary, and deeply suspicious of the very people he was meant to rule. Where Johann wanted to modernize the army to save lives, Franz Ferdinand wanted to expand it to project power. It is a haunting irony that the man who replaced the missing Archduke was the man whose assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 would trigger the First World War. Had Johann Salvator remained in Austria, had he been there to temper the court, or perhaps even to influence the succession, the trajectory of the 20th century might have shifted. His absence left Emperor Franz Joseph surrounded by sycophants and warmongers, with no one left who dared to speak the truth to power. Furthermore, the specific warnings that Johann had penned in his controversial military pamphlets decades earlier came true with terrifying precision during the Great War. He had warned that the Austrian army's obsession with parade ground drills and aristocratic leadership would lead to slaughter in modern combat. In 1914, the Austrian army marched into Serbia and Galicia, led by the very generals Johann had despised, men who owed their positions to their family trees rather than their competence. The result was a massacre. Hundreds of thousands of Austrian soldiers were killed in the opening months of the war because of outdated tactics and logistical incompetence. The lions led by donkeys were slaughtered exactly as Johann had predicted. From the bottom of the ocean, the Red Archduke was vindicated, but it was a vindication written in the blood of an empire he had tried to save. As the empire crumbled in 1918, shattering into a dozen new republics, the legend of Johann Orth experienced a brief final resurgence. In the chaos of the collapse, with starvation stalking Vienna and the Emperor Karl abdicating, desperate people once again looked for a savior. Rumors flickered like dying candles that Johann would return from South America to lead a new Austrian republic. But he did not come. The silence from the sea remained absolute. The monarchy that had rejected him was now dust, its palaces turned into museums, its titles abolished by law. In a final twist of irony, the new Austrian Republic outlawed the use of von and noble titles. Johann, who had voluntarily become Johann Orth, was the only Habsburg who had been ahead of his time even in his name. He had been a citizen of the future living in the past. Today, the mystery of the St. Margaret remains one of the great cold cases of maritime history. Modern oceanography and satellite imagery have mapped much of the ocean floor, but the waters around Cape Horn are among the most hostile and least explored on Earth. The seabed there is a graveyard of ships, a chaotic jumble of currents and canyons. It is unlikely the wreck will ever be found, and perhaps that is how it should be. A discovery of the wreck would reduce the legend to rusting iron and scattered debris. It would provide a physical finality that contradicts the spirit of his life. Johann Salvator did not want to be found. He spent his life trying to escape the public eye, trying to strip away the layers of projection and protocol to find the authentic human being underneath. The ocean granted him that ultimate privacy. We must also spare a thought for the human dimension of this tragedy, stripping away the titles and the politics to look at the man and the woman. At its core, this is a story about the terrible price of authenticity. Johann Salvator had everything the world tells us to desire: wealth, status, power, and fame. Yet he found these things to be a prison. He realized earlier than most that a life lived entirely for others, a life scripted by centuries of tradition, is not a life at all. His journey was a desperate, violent attempt to reclaim his own soul. He sacrificed his birthright for the right to choose his own wife, his own name, and his own destiny. But Johann Salvator's life had ended. His myth was just being born. In the vacuum created by his silence, the man dissolved, and the legend took hold. While the Habsburg dynasty he left behind was slowly ground into dust, assassinated in Sarajevo, crushed in the trenches of the Great War, and finally obliterated in 1918, he remained untouched by the decay. He escaped the slow, humiliating death of his empire by vanishing into the timeless indifference of the sea. He became the phantom of a better future that never arrived, a progressive ghost haunting the ruins of a reactionary machine. The ocean granted him the one thing Vienna never could, a sanctuary that no secret police could penetrate. By denying the world a corpse to bury and a tragedy to quantify, he achieved a strange kind of victory. He left behind no grave in the suffocating gloom of the imperial crypt, no bronze sarcophagus to weigh him down. There is only the wind howling around the jagged rocks of Cape Horn, preserving the secret of the prince who realized that the only way to truly save his soul was to let the world believe he had lost it. The Archduke was dead, but Johann Orth was finally, terrifyingly cheap.